Hello all, and welcome to our weekly Socrates webinar. For those of you who are returning, you may not know me. I'm Cynthia Aquario, the Socrates Program Manager. We are very pleased this week to be welcoming Iyad Rawan, the Director of the Center for Humans and Machines at the Max Planck Institute for Human Development, and Bill Powers, writer, journalist, and technologist, and the author of Hamlet's Blackberry, Building a Good Life in the Digital Age. They will be discussing today their recent op-ed in the Boston Globe, in which they propose a new way to create a social contract where technological tools can be used for good. They both met at MIT and are working together now at the Max Planck Institute and have been thinking deeply on these issues and are looking forward to fleshing out some of these ideas, conflicts, issues that come around the issue of how we can make surveillance work for us. As usual with Socrates webinars, for those of you who have come, we ask that you ask questions after about 25 minutes to 30 minutes of discussion. We will open the floor to you. And Cordell, our executive director, will be joining us to lead and moderate the question and answer section. And as usual, we're sure that there will be lots of very interesting and deep questions that you will come up with. So without further ado, I will leave it to you, Iyad and Bill, to flesh out this topic. And I'm looking forward to listening from the back end.
Thank you, Cynthia, to you and the team for organizing this, and I'm glad to be here. I know you are too, Iyad.
Absolutely.
And so, if I could just start, Iyad and I were discussing yesterday. We were trying to reconstruct how we came to write that op-ed. We talk so often that we actually weren't completely sure where it started. But what we landed on is that. We were struck in early 2019 by the publication of Shoshana Zuboff's book on surveillance capitalism, The Age of Surveillance Capitalism, and we found it a very compelling book. I'm sure some of you are familiar with it. I often assign pieces of it in the Socrates seminars that I occasionally lead, and it seems to provoke people to have some new thoughts about where we're headed with technology. I attended a talk by Zuboff in February at Wellesley College here in Massachusetts, where I live. And as I told Iyad at the time, she ended the talk. Someone asked her in the Q&A, well, what should we do? I mean, you're very convincing surveillance is a problem. You know, do we get the companies to start doing it differently? Do we boycott their products? Not very likely that's going to happen. What should we do next? And Zuboff said, this is not up to the companies, this is up to democracy. We have to get our government to care about these questions and to somehow restructure how surveillance works through regulation, through passing new laws and so forth. So that was a provocative idea for us. And we decided, because of the events that have happened recently and sort of shined a light on the positive parts of positive possibilities of surveillance, that we would write sort of a conversation starter about, wait a minute, maybe we can actually have the good of surveillance and not the bad if we rethink it. And if you've read the op-ed, you know that's the point of the op-ed. And really, we're not pretending to have the answers. We were really wanting to start a conversation just like this. So thank you all for joining us. And with that, I'll ask Iyad, how was that account of our basic entry point?
Yeah. I think it's a great account, and I think it's maybe a complementary perspective on it is that people like Zuboff and other thinkers are extremely good at deconstructing the ideas that we take for granted in society today, and really going deeply into the power struggles that underlie them and the power imbalances that shape them. But I think in addition to having a really good critique of the systems that we have, the complement of that is the ability to propose alternative solutions. And this has always been the motto of MIT, you know, mind and hand. Actually, is the motto of MIT. And we met at the Media Lab. So I was a professor there, and Bill was working as a a research scientist. And so we come with this appreciation for the critique, but also a desire to propose solutions and to explore possible solutions. And I think without exploring possible solutions, whether they're technological or policy oriented, we can't move forward. We'd be stuck and stagnant in this kind of complaining mode. And I think that's another way to put the point of the op-ed. It's a call to action. Well, what do we do about it? Because I think we're all familiar with the complaints. So where do we start thinking about the solutions?
Great, thank you, Iyad. So do you think that, I got a few responses from folks I know who read the piece who said, wow, that sounds really nice, but can we ever really pull that off? I mean, the op-ed's been out for a couple months, not quite 2 months now. Do you remain confident that we're throwing out something that's practically possible?
Well, I think it's possible, and I think my hunch, and I don't know, maybe it's the part of the world that I come from. I come from an ancient part of the world that's not very functional at the moment. I was born in Syria. I often think the solutions are in the past to new problems. It's just a matter of finding out what old problem that we've already solved could apply here. Because we have this notion, or let's say fetish with new ideas. The solution has to be new. It has to be some new gadget or some new AI or something that Silicon Valley can build that will solve this problem. And there's a lot of techno-utopianism that tries to solve these problems with cryptography and blockchain and this and that. And I don't think these technologies are going to be sufficient because ultimately they're driven by the same forces that are creating the problem in a sense. Companies that have, they're offering incredible services that have made our life incredibly easier and richer, especially now when we're stuck at home and we're able to connect with so many people and have interesting conversations and continue with civilization. That's a great thing. But the solution and the balance of powers cannot come from the same place as the cause, if you like, of the friction and the frustration that people are feeling about this surveillance from tech firms. So maybe the solution is in old ideas about, well, how do we design a new compact, a way of limiting new powers that are emerging while also benefiting from their immense powers and conveniences. And that's another part of the op-ed. And I think we can, and the use of the word social compact or social contract is deliberate because this is a very old idea.
Thank you. May I ask you another question?
Sure, please.
So this is something we talked about when writing the op-ed, and then it didn't make it into the op-ed because of length. And we had a whole, as I recall, sort of long paragraph about this, but I think it really still matters. So I wanted to sort of surface that for the folks who were nice enough to join us. So we talked about how strange it is that we live in a time that's a little bit of a reversal from civilization in the past, where, or at least many civilizations, where government was looked to in democratic civilizations as a source of kind of answers, and a place, we founded this country, we can now pass laws and regulations to fix problems, sort of a sense of trust that can happen. Whereas the private sector and business, particularly, I know in this country, in the US, in the last 100 years or so, there has been reason for skepticism, and we went through the industrial age, which had all these human downsides and so forth. But we're now in kind of a reversal of that, where people are not thinking of the government solution because there's a feeling like we need what business is offering us, and it's so convenient and so forth. We're kind of dependent on it. And maybe government's not so good at that stuff anymore that we talk about really in the op-ed. Did I say that articulately?
Yeah, I think I think this point has made it in some form to the op-ed, and it's that in a way we recognize that the companies have immense data about us, and that we really have very little control over how this data is used. And we sense that it could be problematic. And indeed, in some cases, there's, political opinion manipulation, for example, can take place very effectively through these channels because they rely on all of this rich data about us. But at the same time, when the reflex doesn't seem to be, at least in the US, doesn't seem to go to government. I would say the situation in Europe is probably different. Speaking now from Berlin, for example, where I would say the government is seen as a source of regulatory oversight over government, over these companies. And of course, with the usual concern that this might stifle innovation in some sense, because there's potential excessive regulation that would just slow down startups and so on. So, but I would say in the US, it seems that government is not really seen as the source of the solution. It's just a source of problems in a way. And I think that's a broader problem than just tech. I think the trust in government institution has been declining for a long time in the US. But perhaps that's, what we're trying to say in the op-ed, and maybe you can elaborate on this, Bill, is that maybe we could, people can recapture government in a sense in order to say, well, we have these problems, you need to solve it for us, and we're going to hold you accountable to that. Do you think that's feasible? Or, especially as an American yourself, do you think?
Yeah, I think something might be shifting on that front for a couple reasons. One is that, and I hope to hear from the folks who've joined us on this question, if they agree, I think there is a rising awareness that surveillance is getting more and more intense and in certain ways intrusive. And now is the time to act. That if we keep letting it evolve on its own, unchecked, and really sort of unchanneled toward the more productive uses and possibilities, it's going to become truly oppressive. I wouldn't say that most people now feel oppressed, but we can see down the road the possibilities for that if it's just kind of like Silicon Valley is running the show. And the CEOs of Apple and Google and other companies have been saying it's time for regulation, so that's a pretty big signal. The other thing that I think is starting to change, I sensed it in a little way, in a small way, in the recent hearings with the CEOs of several of the big companies on Capitol Hill. In the past, we've had years of sort of embarrassing imbalance in tech sophistication between the legislators asking the questions and the people from California mostly answering them, and the legislators, many of them from an earlier generation, didn't actually often seem to know what Facebook was even, for example. And I saw some more sophistication in that more recent hearing as younger people are coming into Congress, and I think that might be starting to shift. And I also just think that this consciousness raising is spreading, and things like Zuboff's book and many other books and articles people have written are really moving us toward a place where people are saying, oh yeah, that is like many other things in our lives that government plays a role in, and we might need this. It looms so large.
But there's something, an idea that I would like to throw at you, Bill, or a question, a provocation that's a little bit maybe tangential to the op-ed, but I think it's related in important ways. So we often have problems with these apps that are influencing us, and they collect all this data about us. And we complain and we say, I'm being manipulated. I'm living in a filter bubble because I'm being fed all this news that agrees with my preconceived notions. But there was at least one study from Facebook. People have raised some questions about the study, but it raises the possibility that we are, at least in part, responsible for our own filter bubble, because even when Facebook presents us with alternative views, we click on the one that agrees with us. So the question, I guess, is to what extent is the solution within us? It's not the whole solution. We're not completely responsible for the solution. I think some things are beyond us.
Right.
Some things need government power or some sort of, agency with teeth. But we also have a responsibility. And that seems to also be an old idea, that the world is full of distractions and temptations, but if you have a good philosophy of life, what would Socrates say? What would Plato say? What would Seneca say about how you conduct yourself in a world where everybody wants a piece of you? So do you think about that?
I do absolutely think about that. The book that got me into your world, into the science and tech world, I came out of journalism, Hamlet's Blackberry. I wrote it 12 years. I started writing it 12 years ago. It came out 10 years ago. And it was really basically proposing that it's on us, in a way, to regulate our own behavior, to be more mindful of the effects that these technologies are having on us, to draw boundaries and so forth, and just to be more thoughtful about our digital lives. But in the decades since I wrote that book, and it's been wonderful to be part of that conversation, I have seen the power of technology grow so tremendously. And I've seen how good it's become at playing to our weaknesses and really kind of manipulate consciously, often algorithms manipulating us in ways that I think are too, I don't want to say overwhelming, but I think it's getting to the point where it's too much to ask of us, all of us, to actually be responsible for having our own self-regulation, particularly when you look at the extent to which our lives are managed by these things. It's gotten to a new place, I think, of we need help, basically.
I agree. And I think, maybe a very, very kind of familiar case in point is we don't have the time to read all of the terms and services that they, in legal language that are thrown at us when we install an app.
Right.
So that's a very clear example where we cannot possibly be expected to be such, as consumers in a capitalist economy, we cannot be burdened with ensuring that, and we can't really negotiate individual terms either. It's not like I disagree with Article, 3.2.a, of this terms agreement. It's a take it or leave it. And there's like very powerful network effects too. Like if all of my immediate family only communicates using one software, I'm not going to get my mom to install some strange cryptographic Linux-based thing that, it's not going to happen.
No.
So in a way, there are forces that are pulling us and diminishing our autonomy in this situation. And that's where, but I think it's where government or other forces can play a role. But I do think that we need to remind ourselves of our own responsibility too.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I would say, because you live in Berlin and I live in Massachusetts, I will say that it's a small thing, but like when I've gone to work with you at the lab and I fly over to Berlin, or I fly to London for some other purpose, I am struck by this thing that happens on the phone where the phone asks me, do you want to have that website you just tried to open on the phone actually track you? And you can check off the ways it can and the ways it can't because of these new regulations. It's not very complicated. It is helping me, make some decisions, and it's sort of empowering me. And maybe Europeans are tired of that. I have no idea, but I have found it to be refreshing that baby step has been taken, and it makes me wonder about new steps we could take that are bigger and more, ultimately more constructive.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, and simplifying the process as well, because I think what's happened is, some companies may be tempted to ask the question, and sometimes you see this. Some companies have fishy practices, so they ask you the question,
right?
So they're compliant, but the button is so prominent. The button in which you agree on everything is so prominent, and the other one is so hidden. And they're using a lot of like behavioral science basically to nudge you. And I've made this mistake sometimes when I'm in a rush. And it's not so easy to change.
Right.
So I think, I think these things have to get a bit more sophisticated in the sense that you have to make the interface simple, and that's part of the function of the government or government regulations, is to simplify the interface to the citizens. Socialist, a lot of like old kind of socialist Eastern Bloc regimes are notorious for creating paperwork and bureaucracy just to tire you. You know, the next signature you need to get is at the other end of town. It's not even in the next floor.
Right.
So you have to constantly be running back and forth, and that's a way of, you know, it's a way of establishing power over your choices and kind of diminishing your autonomy in a sense. And I think you could do something similar, even if you're compliant, quote unquote. So I think we really have to be very sophisticated about the way in which we monitor compliance with those things that respect citizen autonomy and don't try and sneak things, you know, surveillance through the back door and so on.
Yeah, I think people are really craving trust. The assumption now is that, I mean, I'm sure everybody has had this who's attending this, where there's a common like conversation you have when you're with people or alone. We're not with people physically much anymore, but when you're kind of in a conversation with friends and someone tells the story about how they were having a conversation with their phone near them, and then like 5 minutes later, an ad popped up for that product, you know? I don't know if, you know, if the supposition there is accurate, but everybody's very suspicious now and doesn't feel they can trust this entire giant global architecture that we're part of to be doing what it's saying it's doing, and to really be, you know, I'm not saying I expect capitalists to be like pro-human in every way, because there's a conflict there, but as we point out in the op-ed, we do have government help nudge it in that direction.
Yeah.
And just the idea of this kind of dark, almost conspiracy stories that we hear about the way they're trying to get at us is not a good sign about the future of digital society. We want one that people believe in and have some trust in, I think.
But I think you hit the nail on the head with the word trust, because at the moment, the lack of trust in government puts people in this very strange situation where we know that the companies are surveilling us. We have this, let's call it illusion, or maybe kind of a way of comforting ourselves that ultimately we are consumers with power. We could choose, you know, to walk away, and that's how we exercise our control over our, you know, and our autonomy. But the truth is, we don't have this autonomy. You know, just like the example I mentioned is, if you want to communicate with family, you're stuck with these network things that capture you as part of the network, because you simply cannot function in the world. I mean, try asking a teenager not to use Snapchat or whatever is the latest one that I haven't caught up with, to, you know, because they would be more autonomous this way. They'll say, well, I need to go to the next party. You know, that's the most important thing in my life at the moment. And we have the adult version of that, essentially. So we have, in theory, we have the choice, but in practice, it's much harder. And I think we need to recognize that in order to start opening up to this other alternative, which is to set some rules, you know, set some ground rules, and to have the power to enforce those rules.
Yeah, I mean, my thinking is that there was one flaw of Zuboff's book, I felt, is that, and she was writing it like pre-2019, so maybe it's a function of when she was writing it, but she does kind of talk about the surveillance almost like it's the classic panopticon from Bentham, or whoever came up with that. I think it was Bentham, where there's this distant thing listening to us and watching us that we can't see, and it's like out there, right? And she doesn't really capture the interweaving of our daily existences with all these apps, and the tension between the good that's coming out of them, which is massive, and the creepy and the intrusive and the bad, basically. And, you know, she only had so much room in the book, but I think that there's a way in which the conversation, when and if the US government gets to the point of having a serious effort on this front, really have to get into the weeds on that. They're very interesting weeds, you know, and it's amazing questions, but this really is the substance of our lives. This is in the middle of it now, everything you and I do every day. And now is the time, you know, it's becoming more immersive every day to actually, I think, to address it before it's too late.
I agree. And I think the solution is not to throw our phones and to go back, you know, in time and give up all of these conveniences, and all the benefits, both for as individuals, but also the public good, things like contact tracing and public health. We need to embrace all these things and move forward. We just don't have to choose the trade-off that's presented to us at the moment.
Can I throw out a question to you? It looks like we have like 5 minutes before we go to the group. At the end of our piece, we talk about sort of 4 or 5 ideas we throw out. And the first one is inspired by our MIT friends, Sandy Pentland's idea of, I'm blanking on what he calls
it. The new deal on data.
For data, yeah. One person I know on Twitter sort of reacted to that privately to me and said, oh, that'll never work. The opt-in, opt-out thing, it's too complicated. You'll never pull it off and so forth. And I wonder, we were just floating ideas and saying it might look like this. We weren't saying that any of these things will definitely work. But specifically on this idea of government jumping in and actually having a constructive role, I asked you this earlier, are you really optimistic? But do you really see hope for that? Maybe living in Europe is giving you some sense that it could work?
I'm optimistic. I think, I think it's clear that the scope of the function of government has really grown since government was invented. Mm-hmm. But if you think of government as an entity that, one of the functions of government, other than protecting borders and so on, is identity. Is basically establishing your identity, giving you an ID or a passport, and saying, this is Bill Powers, mm-hmm. was born on this day, and so on. And that's a very important function because it's the foundation of property rights and financial transactions and so on. And there's no reason why your identity is just your name and your date of birth. Your identity is also all of these things about you that are now known by all the companies that have installed apps on your phone. Mm-hmm. Your movement patterns, your social interaction, your proximity, who's near you within Bluetooth reach and so on. So this idea of New Deal on data is that this identity, this information is yours. It's part of, it's the government role to protect it, just like it's the government role to protect your identity from theft. If somebody steals your identity, there will be government agents chasing them and holding them accountable because they've misused your identity, they've misappropriated it. So that's kind of the underlying idea. Now, of course, people could still steal it, right? Could still misuse it, and there would be a black market and so on. But now there are black markets for passports and
right,
and so on. So and social security numbers. So we have these problems. They're not fully solved, but we're in a pretty good equilibrium, I would say. So I think that's the notion. So we should expand ideas that we're already familiar with and that we know function to a pretty good degree, if only we could trust.
Right. So this goes back to your idea that even though we're living in a whole new world thanks to technology, in a broader sense, we've been here before in terms of like what society's about, the things that it can do, the things that it ought to do for people like us.
Yeah, I'm not a historian, but I'm a computer scientist, but I always find myself looking into the past.
Yeah.
More.
And as you know, I like to do that too. Yeah. Yeah. Great. So I think we're almost there for Cordell to jump in for the Q&A. I'm actually not sure how this works. I see we have some questions. Let's just keep chatting till he appears. Oh, here's Cynthia.
So, Cordell has actually, I think he knows I'm gonna be a problem causer, so he actually asked me to do the Q&A. I'm Cynthia back again.
Hi, Cynthia.
He knows I love to play devil's advocate, so
great.
He's causing problems already. So I'm going to start off with one question because we've talked a lot about privacy, which is something that's very concerning, I think, for Western Europeans, Americans. This idea of ownership, private ownership of your data, of your identity, which I think is, and please jump in if you disagree with me, but is a somewhat Western ideology and a thinking of your data. And I know there are other parts of the world that COVID is revealing that having maybe not so much protection over your private data leads to actually better results. I'm thinking of South Korea, China, some other places in Southeast Asia where the government is very actively surveilling its citizens in a way that I think in America, I definitely know, and I assume in Europe also to a certain degree, there would be extreme backlash if there was surveillance of the kind that's happening. So I guess in a devil's advocate spirit, are there ways, has COVID shown that perhaps there are times when we should let our government or companies surveil us and release some of this idea of privacy?
Yeah, I could maybe take a first stab at this. I think, and this is controversial to say, right? In the West, I think that it may be a good idea to let the government or certain health agencies access private data, social interaction data in order to promote the public good. And, let's say that in theory, suppose that it's proven, let's for the sake of the argument, that it's proven that you could save 100,000 lives in a pandemic if only you could map the social network. And we have it, and it's been mapped. It's not like it hasn't been mapped. So if you just use that data, how important is that information that we've already given up to protect from the government? How many lives? Is it 100,000? Is it 500,000? It has to be a number, right? So I think the question that we need to ask ourselves is, do we just put a ban on this and say, in principle, no government shall access this data under any condition? Or do we say the government can access it under the following conditions and then should delete it and cannot use it for other terms, and it has to be an independent oversight agency to prosecute the government if they violate these agreements, the social contract? To me, this sounds like a more forward-looking, more practical solution that wouldn't give us this impossible choice.
And if I could jump in, I would agree with you, Iyad, but I don't know if I would have agreed before COVID. That has been really a revelation to me. The power of watching these other countries do such a good job on the disease and on the virus, and feeling frustrated and angry sometimes that we didn't have the capacity to do that, partly because of leadership failures, but also I think culturally, Cynthia, as you're pointing out, there does seem to be a divide, country to country, culture to culture. I don't know if it's necessarily purely East-West. I have spent time in Eastern, in Asian countries where there did seem to be a real premium placed on privacy, but I'm no authority on that. But I do wonder if the globe, like the world, generally speaking, isn't moving slowly, I'm sure, but moving toward a new thinking about this, no matter what culture you're in, because we've been through this terrible time together.
And I think this leads into a question that Stephen Bates has kind of raised of kind of the tension that we're hitting on, which is a larger tension that's not a privacy question or even a tech question, but what is our relationship to government, and at what point can a government step in, or a company? We're hitting on that with Twitter and Facebook of how do you monitor speech? How do you encourage people to be better citizens? And as Stephen points out, we were talking about information silos. At what point do companies or the government step in and say the way that information is flowing, the way these algorithms are flowing, are undermining the state? And in America, we think of the state as something that's like this big brother, kind of scary, but at other times you need, as you guys were saying, it's an ancient concept of the social construct. At what point does the government, do individual companies step in and say, having everybody just hear the same opinion as theirs and hear misinformation and hear think of themselves as other increasingly, is that damaging to the social fabric? And at what point do we say, and who do we say steps in?
Go ahead, Bill.
Okay, I have one immediate thought, which is great question, both Stephen and Cynthia. Thank you. There is something really kind of creepy, I think, about the notion of the government saying you're having bad conversations. Time for us to step in there and make sure you have good conversations. But it's a function of us being like that. Those questions are floating around is that we're really in new territory. You know, like the original public square was a public square that nobody theoretically controlled, right? It was like you walked out into the square and had a conversation. And then we had, you know, let's say newspapers emerged, and a kind of a relatively civil way of that being a conversation developed, partly with the private sector owning the newspapers, and then people how they wanted to use them, and something very, you know, in the last couple hundred years, something very productive emerged there in those media, and maybe to some extent in TV too, although that's a different place. But this one that we're in now, this idea that we're all in these silos of conversations in these unbelievably profitable companies that are making money off us essentially being in filter bubbles, and it seems to be tearing democracy apart. How the heck do we get out of that? You know, I mean, to Stephen's question, we, you know, we're the filter bubbles, we don't want to be in that place, and there's no obvious route. We haven't faced this exact challenge before. Maybe Iyad has something constructive to say on it.
I think maybe an old analogy is good too. So there's a famous statement by Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes about shouting fire in a crowded theater. You know, so you have free speech, but if you shout fire in a crowded theater and there's a stampede that kills people, then you're liable. You know, even though you're protected supposedly by free speech. So there are limits to free speech, and that's one important example. So I think we need to figure out, so when we think about what is the equivalent of a, let's say, opinion stampede that makes democracy dysfunctional, what is a level of harm that you can point at and really, that is indisputable? What's let's call it an algorithm-induced shouting fire in a crowded theater, where the algorithm somehow caused some kind of opinion stampede, or where damage was done, where people ended up going to the street for the wrong reason, or whatever. I think we need to have that conversation, and we need to develop metrics. Maybe this is something that technologists and scientists can also help with, so that we can establish that in this case, this damage was avoidable and it was caused by this particular way of filtering information or sharing information. We don't have the sophistication yet of dealing with it for many reasons. One of them is scientists also have limited access to these companies and the algorithms they operate. There's no mandate. It could be independent scientists, or it could be a government agency with scientists who could probe and audit algorithms, for example. So there are many ideas, and of course there are ways, perhaps technological ways of subverting, you know, avoiding the whole thing. Like I think somebody mentioned the question about blockchains with zero knowledge proofs to create ethical surveillance, and I think some of those problems may indeed be solvable, you know, preventable completely from a technological point of view, but I don't think that's going to be sufficient. So we need all the tools at our disposal, and as well as these old metaphors. Perhaps somebody else also mentioned the Fourth Amendment about ownership of you as a person. Is your data part of that? So maybe we could, you know, build on that. I'm not a legal scholar, so I don't know the extent to which you can extend that term, but there are, I imagine we have lots of old tools that can be applied here.
So I think you're hitting on something here that I've seen in a number of the different questions. You know, this question, somebody else, an anonymous person asked, you know, data for labor, paying people for their data, privacy, you know, the idea of ownership of your data. Bill was bringing that up. If it is property, which it hasn't been treated as necessarily so far, you know, how can we utilize that to and give the government the tools, if it is actually treated as property, to ensure that it is protected and that we have those rights that we would over any other property. I think that's hitting on a tension that up till now our data isn't necessarily our property, and if so, it's seen as all of these apps are free, and that's the trade-off. You're giving that's your payment for using the service, is your data. So how would these companies be able to reform in terms of their model of making money? That's how they operate, is they sell our data. So do they start charging us? Is that something we're willing to do, is to be charged to use Google for each search, and we in return get paid for our data? You know, what do you guys think of the feasibility and the possibilities of that?
Yeah.
I think I've thought about this a lot because, while some people are willing to pay for things that are free today, not everybody wants to do that. So I think we should be able to continue to do what we're doing now, if that's what we want. But the problem is we don't have the other option. So, a couple of years ago, particularly when I was reading Zuboff, I did an experiment. I'm a computer scientist. I'm tech savvy reasonably. I tried not to use all of these things. I tried to switch to like encrypted email, and so it's an absolute nightmare. Nothing works. It doesn't work across devices. You need to install 10 different extra plugins and it breaks. And then you have to, they're small companies. They don't have the resources that big companies have. So I felt like I basically was defeated by the current system, of surveillance. And I felt like I don't have that option. I can't pay to not have things personalized, for example, or to not have my data, even if I could, right? Even if I wanted to really badly. And that's a problem. So if somehow companies were forced to do two things, give me an option where I can pay to not, and maybe there could be a market big enough, where this would be available. But also, even if I don't pay, just put some limits on how this data could be sold. Like, I need to have some transparency about it. At the moment, there's black markets where all of this data is being shared, and I think oversight is extremely limited. So potentially the value that could be extracted from that data is infinitely high, but the costs, to the companies that are providing them is bounded. And that's, I think, the asymmetry that we're trying to deal with. That, let's just say there's a limit. You need to delete the data after some time, or you need to, you could use it for certain things, but you can't sell it. Or if you need to sell it, some sort of oversight so that we could notice things if things are getting out of control. And maybe if they're not, then it's fine. We continue as we are.
Yes, I like that vision, Iyad, but I would say there's a comment here from Fred Farber that is, how do we make the government take action sort of on these kinds of fronts that you're talking about? And he said the answer is to get the population to actually ask for it, which I think is really true. This conversation we're having today is a very high level conversation that the average citizen is absolutely not thinking about or involved in. Congress people are not hearing from the masses on these concerns. I don't think yet. They're seeing op-eds and so forth, but it's not like people have kind of shrugged their shoulders and said, this is life, whatever, they're watching me. And I don't know if getting the population to ask for it, as Fred said, is on the horizon. I mean, would there have to be a gigantic version of calling fire in the theater to get people?
Yeah.
We had one in our election 4 years ago that seemed like a turning point, and yet still, there doesn't seem to be a huge amount of momentum. This contradicts a little bit what I said in the beginning of the rising consciousness, but I don't think we're there yet.
I agree with you. Maybe I wonder if the way that military, control over military power is a good place, and I don't know the history of that, but I have a hunch that that would be a good place to look, because there were times where, you know, the rulers had the army, and basically that's what we do. And if you don't like it, the army goes into the street, you know, so the same army that fights wars is going to come and force everybody, you know, at knife point to comply. And then at some point, you know, in Rome, the army had to, you know, couldn't cross the Rubicon, right? So there was this separation that ultimately military power is beholden to civilian power. And today, any military in the West in 5 minutes could take over the country if they wanted to, but they don't. And we're fine with that. And we trust that this wouldn't happen. So, and we're talking about firepower, like real firepower. We're not talking about surveillance and opinion manipulation. So we're talking about something much more powerful. Yet we have it under control. How did we do this? And what are the tools that we could perhaps mobilize, and the lessons that we could transfer to the problem we have today? And maybe something like crossing the Rubicon moment is the one where, you know, once if we have the idea ready, then we could activate that idea at that moment.
You know, it's interesting. You're basically pointing at culture. You know, Rome, that's a long time ago, you know, and that was like, you know, a certain stage in the cultural evolution of the West, that maybe this feeling about the military, this belief, began to be sort of embedded in the culture that we still have today. And that's what makes it almost unthinkable in most democracies that this could happen, even though it is possible. I read an interesting piece recently about the Swedish paradox with COVID, and how is it that the Swedes had this relatively loose regime for COVID, and it kind of worked out. You know, it looked like it was bad for a while, but now the numbers are actually, in retrospect, looking very good. And this person wrote, the reason it worked out is that Swedes have social distancing and social cooperation completely coded into their culture. And they kind of didn't have to, you know, impose it on people. They did it naturally. And so the question is, in a society as complicated as the US, could anything like that possibly emerge for digital? I don't know. It's hard for digital life. It's hard to kind of imagine what it would be.
Maybe it is a Fourth Amendment, like what somebody said.
Well, I think you're hitting on something interesting here, because you've got the military and you've got culture, which generally are run through centralized systems, through some kind of federal government, through pooling of communal resources, through taxes or other means to fund a communal effort. And in this case, you've got something that's a public good that's run by private companies. So, you know, how do you, and I'm trying to think of examples throughout history of when something that was so widely used by the population was a private good. And I think that's one of the issues that we had, is that, you know, the public you know, the Agora or the Zocalo, or, you know, these spaces in the past were communal property to a certain degree. It wasn't a private owner of the public square. So how do you, and, you know, I would push back a bit on this idea that Google or Twitter or any of these private corporations are sinister, or that, you know, I think it's important that we recognize the innovation that they've created and the huge benefit, you know, that you were mentioning earlier, to, you know, how many things we're able to do now that we weren't able to do through these I mean, we're having this conversation on a platform that, I mean, 15 years ago could have happened, but it would have been really glitchy. So, you know, these are amazing services. And so they're, you know, recognizing that these companies aren't sinister, but they are operating public fora, and public goods. And how do you negotiate that? How do you recognize their private investment and creation, but also monitor what has now become a public square?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting to look back at the origins of these big companies that we like to trash now. And they were mostly all founded by these really idealistic young people who like really felt they were solving this important problem. but then it becomes a big capitalist entity and shareholder value takes over, and it kind of explodes in this whole other direction, and there's no sense of balance, really, it seems to me. And we're living that now, and we really don't, you know, the business roundtable and all these organizations will put out new ideas for business ethics and so forth, but it's very, again, it's very high level. It's not like, okay, how do we actually execute that with this specific problem of the surveillance society? And we just, I mean, that's really why we did the op-ed, to try and get people talking more practically about what are some visions and what are some steps that we could take.
Yeah, so I think I agree totally with Bill. I think we need to first figure out what we want, you know, before we ask them. We need to agree on that. So what is it that we want? Do we, you know, I want all the conveniences. I want to have information at my fingertips. Sure, everybody here does. That's not something to not want. It seems absurd. But at the same time, and I also don't mind certain forms of personalization. You know, I like the things to be suggested to me, you know, like what cafes to pop up on the map, to be, you know, conveniently located, to match my preferences, maybe use history or use, you know, the preferences of the people that I interact with and so on. That's a good thing. You know, I don't have a problem with this, but maybe I have a problem with it if it starts interacting with my child and influencing them, you know, my children, to buy certain things. Maybe listening to me in my private conversations at home, that I have a problem with. And maybe if it's just an algorithm listening to me and it's deleted, maybe that's okay too. Like there are, you know, we're willing to negotiate. Is the point that the sometimes maybe we have all of these primitive concerns about private information being used by other people against us and so on. But you know, a machine is just a machine. So if it ends there, maybe it's fine, and maybe that's a contract we opt into as citizens of the 21st century. But we need to understand what's happening before we say this is okay and this is not okay. And now we're like, you know, investigative journalism, but like extremely primitive in comparison with, you know, what's happening behind the firewall of the companies. And I think that's what's causing this distrust.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we have two comments here from, and you know, I know both of you can see these, so you can correct me if I'm reading them incorrectly, but it seems to be, they're saying, they're both touching on anonymity. And one is saying that perhaps there's too much anonymity of digital users and programmers, and that's where some of the bad behavior is coming from. And the other comment is saying, actually, you don't really have anonymity, you know, pointing out that everybody's registered for the Zoom call, that we all have IP addresses, that that it's this illusion that, you know, Google says, oh, we saw your data, but it's anonymized. But, you know, is it really? People have shown that they can very easily trace it back to you through, you know, very simple tactics. So is anonymity critical to this discussion, and can anonymity be created or protected in this world we live in?
I want to let Iyad answer that because he's strong on the technical part of, and among other things.
Yeah.
But I want to say that just on that I think both of those things are true. Both of those comments are true from Gene and Fred, in that on one hand, anonymity causes all kinds of problems, like Twitter. You know, imagine if everyone were a known entity on Twitter. We wouldn't have all these bots and so forth causing all these problems. But on the other hand, as Fred points out, you know, we're kind of known more than we've ever been known before. And that is also a problem and a creepy thing that people are worried about. Sorry, go ahead, Iyad.
Yeah. No, I totally agree with you. I think, I don't think total anonymity is a solution. I mean, I think we've realized this, that there would be more trolls, more fake, you know, fake news, more spam mail, and, you know, Nigerian princes and so on. So I think it's good. You know, we've always lived in a society where people could see our face and they could recognize us and they could gossip about us, now about our good behavior and bad behavior. That's how norms are shaped. And and the social fabric is created, and that's perhaps a good thing. You know, of course, anonymity is sometimes essential when you're trying to, you know, subvert the system, and sometimes, you know, whistleblowers and things like this, that's a very specific thing. But in general, by and large, I think for normal social interaction, we identify ourselves, and that's a very important thing. But identifying ourselves shouldn't come at this large cost. And maybe we could have technological solutions to this where we encrypt our data. Maybe we could have legal solutions to them as well, where the data is there and can be used in these useful ways, but cannot be misused. And these are the boundaries that we need to create. But I think, you know, to kind of take the conversation full circle, that distrust of government basically prevents a lot of people from looking to government for the solution, because there's this assumption that government is only going to make things worse. You know, because if they control the data, well, now they're going to misuse it even more. And I think that's a problem, because then we're stuck between the capitalists who are, you know, they mean well, they're not evil by definition. They're trying to build something useful and it has been useful. But sometimes their incentives are not aligned with the public good. And we need to identify those cases, and we need to make sure that they're held accountable. At the same time, but you know, we can't distrust both and end up in this very strange place where we're not doing anything. And I think that's the problem.
Do you think, you know, I know we have to wrap it up soon. We have about 4 more minutes, but do you think there is an argument that all of this has become bigger than anybody can understand? The technology companies also, that they've created systems, algorithms, and quantities of data that are bigger than even they know what they are. I asked this in part based on the congressional hearings here in the US, that a number of the questions, you began to see the responses of these executives and realizing that these companies are bigger than even they cannot even understand and grasp. Do you think that's hitting on something, or is that just my perception? That's a me question.
I'll jump in and say that was really mirrored in my experience at the Media Lab for 5 years at the MIT Media Lab, where these folks would come in from these very companies to meet with us. And I won't name any specific ones, but they were some of the big companies we would see pretty often. And there was a little bit of a deer in the headlights quality to their, to sort of like, whoa, we didn't see this coming. You know, do you guys have any ideas? You know, and there's something sort of encouraging about that, but also a little bit scary, you know, because they have so much power now, or very scary, actually. Iyad?
Yeah, I think this relates actually to a comment about, you know, machines are not just machines. They embody processes, and these processes can create power imbalances and inequalities. And I think this is true not just of algorithms, but of complex systems in general. You know, they encode constraints on different actors, and some actors are better able to use those constraints to their advantages, you know, to their advantage over others. And it's really hard to revise, let's call them institutions, you know, so they could be algorithms, they could be rules, formal rules, laws, and so on. And in a way, they have these emergent properties that are maybe unforeseen by their designers. And that's a very difficult thing to study and to understand scientifically. So I think there are two ways of dealing with this. One is you say, well, I'm going to wait until I fully understand this thing, this beast, but it's evolving constantly. That's really hard. The other alternative, I think, is a bit more promising, is to experiment with different varieties. So you create maybe different experiments in different cities or jurisdictions where you try out new ideas. And I think this has been happening around the world. You know, it's not, which is very encouraging, to try out these different ways of defining ownership. And maybe some problems just go away, and then you know, and these things start spreading. So I think perhaps we could be a little bold in experimentation with some of these ideas as a pragmatic way forward, rather than this kind of one monolithic solution top down.
Mhm.
I totally agree with that, Iyad. And I want to say one sentence. I want to say that my favorite part of the op-ed actually didn't come up, so I think it might be not that popular of an idea, but the idea that we could reverse the surveillance dynamic and that we citizens might have some surveillance capabilities, including on government itself. And I would love that to be part of one of these experiments. Maybe you and I could find a town in Europe somewhere and see if they would do that with us.
Yeah.
That's fantastic. Yeah, I think you've hit on a question that Glo just brought up of, how can this idea, in an increasingly individualized society, how can we both look to government, but also look to ourselves to understand better these algorithms, these inequities, these, in reclaiming our decision rights, as Glo states it, how can all of us, and I think that's one thing that we assume Google, we assume the researchers understand it, and I think there's a degree that we've unleashed things that nobody really understands. So how can we all work together to understand better these systems that we've created and the data that we're putting out, and see ourselves as part of it, generators of it, and how can we, each and every one of us, contribute to shifting the needle, if you will.
Great idea.
Well, thank you both so much, Bill and Iyad. This was a pleasure. I think you've got us all thinking deeply, and thinking we're going into an election here in the U.S. So I think it's more important than ever to think about our government and what we ask of them. So thank you both. And next week we're going to have another fabulous webinar, and we hope you all join us. I'm going to bollocks up the name of it, but it is on, once again, we've been doing a series on equity and capitalism. This one will be called Creating a Higher Form of Capitalism, How Business Can Be the Catalyst for Revitalization of Urban Communities. We'll be joined by Mark Wilson and Beverly Norman Cooper, and we hope you all join us next week. So thanks again to Bill and Iyad, and everybody have a wonderful day.
Thanks so much, Cynthia. This was
Thank you.
great. Thank you.